Hi everyone, I'm Liz, and welcome back to Elizabeth Ann Can Stitch. Hi everyone, welcome back to episode 2 of my Fat Quarter Hourglass Remix Quilt Along. Apologies for the slightly delayed video and different voice. I had some sickness last week. I actually went to the doctor and had a sinus infection, an ear infection, and bronchitis. So sorry this video has been a little bit delayed, but I've been trying to, make my head feel like a human again. It's been pretty stuffed full, but I'm back. And I'm back with you today to show you the next steps for creating this hourglass quilt. So in today's video, I am going to walk you through how I prep my fabrics for cutting, how I cut them out, and sew up the Magic 8 half square triangle technique. I linked to that in my last video, which if you haven't watched video number 1 of this series, I'll link it down below. It explains what we're doing here, what kind of quilt we're making, and I also linked to the Magic 8 half square triangle technique, and I'm going to walk through that in my video today. And then by the end of the video, we will end up with 80 half square triangles ready to go and ready to make our hourglass blocks. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, this is kind of an odd angle, but welcome to my ironing board. I've got my stack of fat quarters, and what I like to do to prep my fabric before cutting is to lightly mist each fat quarter, crumple it up. Why am I describing it? I should probably just show you, but I like to prep my fat quarters before I cut into them. You don't have to do this step, honestly. You can go straight to cutting. Some people, I think especially Kimberly Jolly talks about this in a lot of her videos, but a lot of people like to starch. And so basically what we're trying to do in this step is get to the fabric to the point at which you want to cut it. So if for you that's unfolding the fat quarter and cutting right in, go for it. I like to use water in pressing to get my pieces ready before I cut. And some people like starch, and maybe there's some other ways out there that I don't know about. So I'm going to show you guys my process and get all of these pressed nice and flat so we can cut them out. I just open up each fat quarter, and I have a little plastic bottle that just has water in it. No starch or anything, just plain old water. And so I just spray the fat quarter and I crumple it into a little ball. And just let the water kind of soak in. I mean, it's barely getting damp. It's not wet. And so then you end up with this lovely wrinkly fat quarter. And then I just use my super hot iron and press this nice and flat. And for me, this just kind of removes some of the stiffness and sizing in the fabric and presses it into a nice flat shape with no warps. And that's how I like to cut out my fabric. If you like starch, again, go for it. If you just want to cut straight into your fat quarters, go for it. I did that I think I only started this process like 3 years ago. So obviously I made plenty of great quilts without ever prepping my fabric, but this is the way I like to do it now. Also, hello, welcome to Sunday afternoon where we wear sports bras and have no makeup on, and welcome. Okay, so now I've got this fat quarter all nicely pressed and ready to be cut. So I am going to do this whole stack and get ready for cutting. Okay, so I have my stack of nicely pressed fat quarters all ready to be cut up. So now I am going to cut all of my fat quarters. I have 20. I'm going to cut all 20 of these into 18-inch squares. So I'm going to work with 2 fat quarters at a time. One, it's going to cut down a little bit of time because I will only have to make 10 cuts rather than 20. And 2, it'll keep my pairs together and exactly the same size because I'm going to cut each pair together. So this is my first pairing. And so I'm going to just kind of line up the selvages Okay, so none of these sides are perfectly straight or square. I mean, they're probably pretty close, but I'm gonna go ahead and give myself a first straight edge to work from. So I am just using my long ruler to go across the full length of the fat quarter. And you wanna be pretty, what do you wanna call it? Like stingy with your trimming, because a fat quarter is technically 18 inches by 21 inches. And we want an 18-inch square. So usually you have a few 1/8 of an inch extra on a fat quarter, so you can trim it up, but just be careful because we do need the full width of the fat quarter. So keep that in mind when you're trimming. Okay. So now I'm gonna go ahead, and we have a little bit more wiggle room left to right, but I'm just gonna go ahead and use my ruler, use one of the lines on my ruler to line up along the edge that we know is completely straight, because that's the edge we just cut. And I'm gonna give myself a nice right angle here in the corner. And so I'm just doing it a little bit in from the edge to make sure everything's trimmed. Both fabrics are getting trimmed. Okay, so now I've got two of my cut lines. And so now I'm gonna flip this and I'm gonna do 18 inches. So I do have an 18-inch mark on this ruler, so, you know, I could put this ruler down and line up the 18-inch mark and know that, you know, this is 18 inches. But then I would have to make a series of small little cuts all the way up. So what I'm going to do is actually use the lines on my cutting board to help me cut out a nice 18-inch square. So I'm going to line this up on this mark right here, which on my cutting mat is just 14, but basically I'm just going to line that up. And then I'm going to go over to 18, which is right here. And I'm going to use the lines on my cutting mat to actually cut this side of my square. So anytime I have to cut larger pieces than a 12.5 by a 12.5 inch square, then I use this method where I use the lines on my board. So now I've got 3 sides, and so I just need to cut this last side. And so I'm just going to line it back up on my board. And you can see, hopefully you can see that I'm actually a tiny bit short of 18 inches up here. So that's telling me that these fat quarters are cut pretty tightly, meaning there's not a lot of extra room in that 18 inches. So that's okay. I know that. I'm going to be super stingy with my trimming on these to make sure I'm getting my full 18-inch square. But there we go. Now I have my first pair of fabrics cut into 18-inch squares. So I am going to do this for all of my 10 pairs of fabrics, and then we'll start marking out our big giant X's. Okay, so I just noticed when I grabbed this pair that this fat quarter is obviously a lot smaller than this fat quarter. So, and both of those 2 previous fat quarters were from this cranberries and cream line. So I wonder if for some reason this fat quarter bundle is just cut a tiny bit smaller. So I need to be really careful about, let's see, using all of this fabric. Ooh, yeah, you can see just how tight of an 18-inch margin that is. So, okay. Good to know. I think on this one, I'm just going to do the 18-inch width before I do the 2 shorter sides. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so now I know it's a little bit tapered on that end, but this side has the full 18-inch width, so I'm going to cut my square from closer to this end. So perfect. Okay. So just keep an eye on that as you're cutting, because, you know, you can do this with smaller squares. Your blocks would just end up slightly smaller, so the quilt would be slightly smaller, right? So if for some reason your fat quarters feel extra tight and you don't want to be super careful, maybe just cut 17.5-inch squares or 17-inch squares. And you can still totally follow everything I'm doing. Your measurements would just be slightly smaller. And so I'm using my board to line up the edge of my ruler, and then I'm using one of the marks horizontally to line up against that straight edge of my fabric, so I keep everything nice and square. Okay, so we have all of our fabric cut into our squares and still paired up. And basically now the next step is to do the Magic 8 half square triangle technique to create 8 half square triangles out of each one of these pairs of fabric squares. And so to do that, we're gonna need to mark a big giant X across one square in each of the pairs, and that will help us you know, give us some guidelines for sewing our half square triangles. So the first step is going to be to mark our fabric, and there's 2 different methods that I think work pretty well. I'm going to show you how to do it with a fabric marker. I'm going to use my air erase marker, and then I'm going to show you the method that actually I'm going to end up using, which is to use my iron to mark my fabric. But I'll show you how to do it with just a ruler and a pen first. Okay, so I'm actually going to flip this over. I want my fabrics right sides together. Okay, so now I need to mark a big X through the center of the square. So one way to do it is to get a big ruler and a pen and mark your X. So you can kind of see though, with these big 18-inch squares of fabric, my 24-inch ruler does not fit, you know, all the way across my fabric, right? So that's why I was looking for ideas for how to mark without using a marker. And so I'll show you how to do that with the iron in a second. But first, I'll just show you how you can mark your fabric with what you have. And you'll notice I didn't go all the way. And don't worry about that, that will disappear. And since my ruler isn't long enough, I've got to do it in 2 passes. Okay, just darkening up that line. And now let me do the other side. So this isn't perfect, but I know this is the right side of the line. Anyways, this is why I don't really love this method, because these fabric blocks are so big, it's hard to get one good straight line. But essentially, this is what you would need to do, is mark an X, and then
I like to pin a couple of pins in each section just to keep the fabric squares together as I sew them, since they're so large. If you were working with smaller squares, you could probably skip pinning, but if I was going to go sit down at the sewing machine at this point, you know, I would pin in a couple of spots around the block. That way the fabric, you know, doesn't shift while I sew. And I'm not pinning too close to the line because I don't want it to get in the way of my sewing machine foot. Okay, and then this would be ready to sew. But let me take you over to the ironing board and show you how I'm gonna mark the rest of my pairs of fabric. Back over to the ironing board, and I'm gonna show you how I'm gonna mark these with my iron. Now, again, I've got my pair of fat quarters, and I really only need to mark one of them because they're gonna be laid on top of each other. So I'm gonna mark this one. And again, it'd be nice if I had a slightly larger ironing board, because these are 18 by 18 inch squares, so they're quite large, but this will work. So I'm just going to show you what I do on my normal sized ironing board, which I have sincerely been thinking about upgrading to a slightly wider one. So maybe this is the push I need. And so I'm actually going to do it, I'm going to put the fabric right side down. That way, when we're sewing, the creases, like you're sewing in the groove, not on a bump, if that makes sense. You'll see what I mean. And so basically, instead of making a line across it, we're just going to do that with the iron. And so you'll see it doesn't quite all fit on the ironing board, but I can make it work. Get my iron hot, and then I'm going to fold this in half. And I just pull the point across until it meets. And then I'm going to set my iron right here in the center and kind of pull back onto the fold and make sure I'm getting the fold right where it needs to be. You can see how nicely that comes together there. Okay, simple as that, my first line. Isn't that great? And then I'm going to open this up, flip it this way, I'm going to bring the center up. Again, I'm going to leave my iron right here in the center and pull back onto that fold, because I know this part of the fabric is laying where it needs to, and so I want to pull back so I don't mess up kind of where the fold is. Okay, and now, hopefully you can see that on camera, but you've got a nice X marked across your fabric. And to get that ready for sewing, I go back over to my cutting board, which is bigger than my ironing board, but you know, you just lay your fabrics right sides together, pin in a couple of spots to keep everything together, and then we take this over to the sewing machine and we do our Magic 8 technique. So yeah, I am, I'm not going to mark them all now because like the lines will kind of fade, right? Like as the fabric loosens up. I don't know. I haven't really tried doing this process in bulk where I mark a bunch and then go sew a bunch. So I think I'll probably end up doing these just one at a time. Lay one down, mark it, pin it, sew it, and then do another set. So yeah, why don't we go over to the sewing machine and let me show you sewing together my first Magic 8 blocks. You can see how that gets put together. Okay, so we have our two 18-inch squares paired together that we're going to use to create 8 half square triangles. And so we're just going to use our marks as a guideline, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch on either side of these lines. So I'm using just a clear flat foot. Actually, maybe I'll use my 1/4 inch foot. So let me switch out my foot. So what I'm going to do, and I know this mark doesn't go perfectly to the corner, but we are going to trim these down later. So nothing has to be 100% perfect. Obviously, you know, we're looking for straight lines and as much precision as we can get, but you will have an opportunity to trim stuff up later. I mean, or at any stage you want to, basically. So I'm just going to follow my guidelines, and we'll see where we get. So I'm just laying my 1/4 inch foot right on that fold that I ironed. And I'm just making sure that my fabric's not bunching or anything. Yeah, see, I don't think I would mark or iron a bunch of these and then stack them up, because it's already getting a little hard to see my lines. So I would do these just one at a time. Alrighty, I'm not even going to cut my thread. I'm just going to roll this around to the other side of my marking, and sew this side. And so we're just creating 2 seam lines on either side of our marked line. Okay, that side's done. Now we're going to do the other marking. Okay, so that's all we needed to sew to create 8 half square triangles. So quick. So let's go to the cutting board and cut these apart. So here is what we just sewed together. So I'm gonna take my pins out and let me flip this over. Well, I guess either way, it's kind of hard to see the lines, but you'll be able to see them, you know, when it's yours in front of you. So I'm just gonna lay this on my mat, and I'm laying it out on the grid just so I know everything's centered. And now we need to cut apart this piece of fabric to create our 8 half square triangles. And so you don't, now that you have this laid out and you're going to start cutting it, you don't want to move this. All you want to move is yourself, your ruler, and your cutter. Don't move this until everything's cut out, just to keep everything lined up as possible. So the first thing I recommend is cutting across the width and the length before you do the diagonals. My mom told me that as a tip when she was making hers, because if you cut these first, these seams are still holding everything together, so it's less likely for your fabrics to get all out of order. Hopefully you don't see too much of my head, or I don't know, in this video, but I'm gonna stand up and position this, and I'm gonna cut right across the center. And so don't disturb your fabric. And now let's go top to bottom. All right, and now we need to go through the diagonals. Okay, everything is cut. And now we have 8 half square triangles. There we go. wasn't that easy? 8 half square triangles at one time. I love this technique. I think if you're creating a bunch of half square triangles, especially with the same fabrics, this is great. So, done. Okay, so I think that's where I'm gonna end this video for today. So basically now you should have all of your fabrics cut out and be able to start sewing them into the half square triangles. I have 1 done. I've got 9 more pairs to go, and I think this just took me about 30 to 45 minutes to do, and I was filming, so it's probably like 20 minutes to do each one of these. It's really not too much at all. So I am gonna get the rest of mine sewn together, and then in our next video, we'll talk about what we're gonna do with all of these half square triangles and how we're going to create our hourglass blocks, which I do have a link to that. If you wanna go ahead and get started, if you already know what you're doing, go for it. But yeah, so in the next video, we'll start creating our hourglass blocks. Okay, thank you guys so much for joining me today, and congratulations on now making your 80 beautiful half square triangles. I am just obsessed with some of the fabric combinations that my blocks resulted in, and I cannot wait to create the hourglass blocks. So I'll be back with another video hopefully soon, showing you how I put together all of the hourglass blocks and then how I lay them out and arrange them to create the quilt top. Oh, and we'll also talk about trimming our hourglass blocks down. So thank you guys so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.